If I was to ask you, what do you think about when I mentioned podcast analytics? If your first answer was, well, obviously podcast downloads, well, you wouldn't be alone. Most of the podcasters that I talk to, that is the first metric that comes to mind. But the reality is that podcast downloads don't really share the whole story. And when you're podcasting for a while, it can feel like there's so much that you don't know about your audience, what is actually working, what isn't, and what is a good combination to turn those listeners into paying customers, or how to turn those listeners into a community that will rave about you and help you become an authority online. This podcast episode is all about that, how to read podcast analytics like a pro, and that will help you understand what are winning episodes and just how to understand who is listening without having to ask. And in case we haven't met, hello, I'm Nick Xavier. I'm the founder of The Podcast Space. I'm a podcast content expert. I'm a marketeer. I love breaking down complex topics like analytics that are absolutely not sexy at all into things that you can understand and implement in your podcast strategy. So without further ado, let's get into this episode because we have a lot of ground to cover and I want you to take notes. Let's go. All right, let's start with a fun number. Did you know that only about 11% of podcasters who start a show actually make it to episode 50? When you're thinking about that, you're actually realizing that there isn't that much competition in the podcast industry because even though a lot of people start a podcast, one of the reasons why they stop podcasting is because they don't understand what the audience wants from them, what they're supposed to be talking about in order to get to their business goals, or how to turn these listeners who are tuning in every single week because you're looking at the downloads and you're like, the downloads are there. Why are the sales not there? Hopefully this episode is going to answer all of those and help you think about analytics in a different way. I want you to stop looking at analytics as a boring thing and also like a gold mine of just insights that you can use to guide your next quarter. As we are closing the year and we're looking into 2024, I've been spending so much of my time working with podcasters to look at their analytics, to make informed decisions about a ton of stuff. And so this episode is going to be an insight into what I do with clients, and you're getting this for free. So lucky you, because this is what I do with clients when we're trying to assess what is a winning combination, and making winning in air quotes. So podcast analytics give you direct feedback into what listeners like and don't like and what you can do better, but also what are the winning topics that you can use to just replicate that success and that concept and get more downloads and increase your listenership. So there are a lot of things that you need to consider when looking at your analytics. And I think the first things first is that you cannot look on a week-to-week basis because that sample is not good enough, is not big enough to help you kind of frame what's going on, because so many things can happen. One, maybe there's a lot of world events that are just taking a lot of attention from people. Maybe there's things like we just got out of Thanksgiving if you're listening to this in real time. So obviously people have less time to consume podcasts. I was looking at my analytics and my numbers were down and I was like, okay, yeah, it makes sense. So those are the two main misconceptions. People are looking at their numbers and they're not looking at a big enough kind of pool of data. So here are a few things that when you're looking deeper, you're understanding. Number one, you're looking at trends. So performance across the year, trends across the year. As I just talked about, holidays are times where most people will listen to less podcast episodes. It doesn't mean that they won't listen to your podcast, but they'll be more selective of the type of content that they're listening. So if you have an audience that is, really hardcore and it's a super fan, they will listen to your podcast no matter what. But if they are an occasional listener, they may skip your podcast content that week. So again, looking at trends overall throughout the year is a really good assumption. So for instance, summertime, wintertime, I know for a fact that January, September, and October, and March and April are really hot months for podcast interest. So basically, like people who want to start a podcast, people who want to relaunch a podcast, people who are wanting to relaunch a new season, I always see a spike. And I always have to talk about in like actually website data, because this has been the first year that I launched my own podcast. And so even though I've been doing it for clients, I always assess the trends within their industry or within the topic that they're covering. But for instance, for me, I can only make this kind of like infer this based on the web traffic, because I still don't have those 12 months of content just yet. But it will be an interesting thing to look into in January, what have been the trends, and if I see 2 years in a row how the content is performing. So again, looking into what are the hot months, when are the slow months, if you're thinking about moving from episodic content into seasonal, maybe that's something that you want to look into when you're looking at your analytics. So then number 2 is topics, right? So when you're looking at topics, you're figuring out, like, for instance, for me, mindset, content strategy, tips and tricks to sound authentic, how to connect deeper with your audience. So I know that some of these topics are quote unquote hotter than others. And so does it mean that I need to make more of a specific topic, do more of interviews with a specific guest? And then speaking of guests, what type of episodes are performing well? Are these the top 10? Are these solo episodes? Are these a combination of solos and interviews? Are these rotating guest episodes? So again, think about that. And then another thing you have to consider is the length of the episode, which I will get into how to do that in a while. But how long are these episodes that you're listening to? Your podcast hosting platform should be able to tell you this information. And so even as you're looking through, you're looking and thinking, oh, wow, are the solos that are shorter performing better? Or are people really tuning in to longer podcast interviews that, that's something that they want because maybe your audience has a long commute? And then very importantly, and something that I did with a client that was not very sure, because a lot of her content was about language. And so titles of the episodes, we were looking at what type of language were the listeners more gearing toward. So were they gearing toward more negative language, more positive language that is more including like how-tos, or are like the ultimate guides, lists, very mysterious titles? What were the titles that had the best performance? And then if you want to actually learn more about titles, you can listen to episode 19, podcast titles that can boost your downloads and mistakes to avoid. I will include that in the show notes because that was a really, really good episode. All right, next one. When you're looking at those podcast analytics, you can really have a better view of your listeners. I talk to so many podcasters who say, hey, I've been podcasting for 20, 30, 50 episodes, and I feel like I still don't know what my listeners want and what they're thinking. So looking at analytics, look at what is the type of person who is listening to this? What can this type of episode tell me about the listener? Right? This takes a little more time and it goes beyond just looking at the numbers. But this is such important information that you need to ask yourself. And lastly, when you're looking deeper, you have to recognize blind spots. And again, I'm going to say, I talked to a client about this because it's true. Not once, not twice, but many times, I'm talking to a client, and when I'm looking at the trends of what is working, they actually recognize that the topics that they were covering were not at all things that they expected. And so in some cases, what we did was we worked together to create a course that covered that content. And it was like an obvious next step for the listener because they were enjoying that content. And it was an insane amount in comparison with everything else. And so it aligned and made sense, but the client just never saw it as a need for their community. So having those episodes and looking deeper into what does this mean beyond the numbers really helped them understand that there was a market for that one topic that they didn't realize was interesting within their community. And another thing is that when you're recognizing blind spots, you may also recognize that your community is asking you to maybe go down to the basics or maybe elevated experiences. So maybe if you've been talking about like very basic one-on-one kind of thing and they are ready for advanced stuff, these are the type of episodes that will tell you like, yeah, these are not performing as well. These are performing very well. And I gotta say, I am so excited because at the end of the year, Spotify releases their Spotify Wrapped, which is a report that every creator, so if you are a musician or if you are a podcaster, you will receive a report with pretty much data that is exciting, like your podcast was released in X amount of countries, or this one episode was really listened to in comparison with like a whatever percentage of everything else. So they're building momentum, they're getting people really excited about this, and to me, that excites me so much because people don't realize how important data is, because that's hard. Just those are numbers. It's, black and white. It works or it doesn't. But also, like, why doesn't it work, right? When you're thinking about what works in your podcast, like, that data gives you concrete direction. And I feel like before Spotify did all of this Spotify Wrapped kind of marketing, not that many people were excited about it, but I've been seeing so much growing excitement about it that I'm like, yes, like, this is so important. And so let's get back into the episode. And how do we find these data? A lot of times I'm getting messages on Instagram of people telling me like, hey, my podcast is here, but I don't really know how to look at podcast on my Spotify. So by default, your podcast hosting platform provides basic data. One of the reasons why I love Captivate so much, which is where my podcast is hosted, and by the way, side note, there's an affiliate link in the bottom, which you should absolutely click and become part of Captivate, because they only have one tier for podcast analytics that gives you access to, as honestly, I would say the best in the market for the price that it is. So I'll say make sure that you do check it out. But where can you find this? So basically, your podcast hosting platform and YouTube, if your podcast is on YouTube. By the way, make sure that you submit your podcast to YouTube Music, because that's available now. So there's 2 billion YouTube users that are going to be using YouTube Music and that can receive your content. So that's a fantastic way to grow your listenership, by the way. And then the most known ones are Apple Podcasts and Spotify for podcasters. So if your podcast isn't hosted on any of these two, you have to look and claim your podcast there, because it will give you additional data that I'm going to be talking about, and super important. And also, if you are a Captivate member, you can actually listen to a Growth Lab session that I did with Captivate's team. And I talked about how to use the analytics and insights that I shared with the audience about like how to read podcast analytics better on Captivate specifically. So that was so fun. And honestly, like, everybody was like, yay, I love analytics now. And I was like, woohoo, mission accomplished. All right, so let's wrap up this episode. So what do you need to focus instead of downloads, just looking every single day, every single week, every single hour? Because I know a lot of people just like refresh. So if you want to improve your understanding of analytics in order to grow your podcast, you have to start looking at month-on-month growth. So not week to week, not day to day. So as I mentioned before, it's not a big enough pool of data for you to make an informed decision. There's a lot of variables. How much did you grow from the month before? And the month before, right? Like, what was your growth for the past 3 months? And I normally say 3 months because a lot of podcasts don't retain their audience for longer than like 3 months. People either graduate from their content or they are just looking for something else, or maybe, the podcaster just pod faded, which has just disappeared. So again, look at the month-on-month growth. And then we're looking into episode consumption. So episode consumption is what some podcast platforms do have that data. I know from, for instance, podcast hosting platform Ocha, which is French, they actually combine Spotify for podcasters and Apple, which are the 2 main podcast platforms. So you can actually see within that dashboard immediately how much people are listening to that episode. So in kind of like quick terms, if a podcast episode is being consumed under 70%, it means that people are not listening all the way through, and you may want to shorten that type of content. And if it's over 100%, it means that people are listening to it multiple times, which is always a good thing to have. So if you have to happen to have 85%, it's great. And then at the back of that, it is also understanding that there's something called starts, streams, downloads, and plays. So all of these are different, and someone may start the podcast, but they may not finish listening to it. And so they may start multiple times, and that's data that you can find on Spotify for podcasters. Someone may download the episode and never listen to it. And someone, when they're streaming the episode, it's probably the most accurate. So basically, they're streaming, listening to it in real time. I'm not even going to get into the terminology of YouTube podcasts because that's a different podcast in its own. But definitely want to let you know that Spotify for podcasters in their backend, and it's, by the way, not Spotify for podcasters, which are two different platforms. I had this multiple times be asked. So if you haven't, make sure that you're claiming a podcast, because you will be able to get access to a lot of really cool data that talks about, like, the starts, the streams, the downloads. And then going back, so we covered the month-on-month growth for about 3 months, and then episode consumption. Moving on to other data that you need to consider is just like why your podcast content that is supposed to drive lead generation and sales isn't performing, or is performing the way it should. So what I mean by this is that a lot of podcasters who are talking about sales and like, for instance, like, I've waited almost a whole year to do a podcast episode based on analytics, because I just kept thinking, oh, maybe I want to do this type of episode, or maybe that one type of episode. And I kept postponing it because to me it was really important, and I will use this podcast episode a lot in conversations with clients. So I kept on delaying it. And so basically that's just like, that data is non-existent. But if you're creating content, and if I had already created content that's specifically talks about like marketing analytics and stuff like that, probably you would want to look at, one, how did you market that podcast? So a lot of times people talk about the things that will drive traffic to their business. And when we are actually looking at the metrics, those downloads are very low. And this can be caused by a few things. Maybe people were not promoting it. You felt so insecure about it that you didn't promote it as much. And so that can explain why those type of episodes weren't performing as well. Or for instance, you're used to doing podcast episodes with other people, and those episodes are solo. So if they're not performing, it's just because you haven't done it enough and you need to practice a little more. And then at the same time, if your listeners are used to hear you talk about other stuff, and you still haven't broken that as like a solid content pillar. And by the way, I'll put a podcast episode that I've done on content pillars in the show notes, because I do have one that if you haven't, you have to listen to it. But anyway, basically saying those types of episodes, sometimes they are not part of the habit of your listeners, and they don't associate it with your content. And so that's sometimes why those episodes won't perform as well. Or sometimes you're literally just really, from the moment of idea to publishing, you're just so uncomfortable that the title, it's not great, you're not putting as much effort into it, or maybe you don't want people to find that episode because it could lead to sales calls, and you actually don't want to talk to people for whatever reason you feel icky about sales call. And so the whole process is just not working for you. It's not necessarily because of the listeners. It was probably throughout the whole process of the episode. Like maybe you rambled a lot on that episode, and so your episode consumption is going to be lower. So I want you to have a lot of attention into when you're talking about things that are money-making activities in your business, like a podcast episode that will eventually make you leads and you're feeling uncomfortable. Why are those numbers low? Right? Because it doesn't mean that your listeners are not interested in the product that you have. You may not have done a good job at making sure that they know that this is something that is part of your business, or that this is a part of your content strategy. So just be mindful of that. And then the number 4 is the relationship between your marketing and your content growth or stagnation. So instead of focusing just on downloads, think about like, are you promoting the podcast? Right? And I hear so many podcasters saying like, Anna, I spend 90% of my time just editing the podcast. And, it's just editing minor things. And so by the time that it's time to promote the podcast, well, then they have no energy, or they're not excited as much. They're doing the bare minimum. And what I mean by that is if your podcast has performed really well, what is the cause of it? Maybe you had a guest that was really exciting and you promote that podcast a lot more than any other episodes. So when you're analyzing the reason that it could lead to those download increases, Is it caused by the marketing process? Or maybe that was a guest that had a lot of influence, right? So it's not just the numbers by themselves, is what led to it. One of the things that I do know, for instance, in my situation, is that I have high-performing pages on my website. And I talked about this on a previous episode where I'm talking about how to double your downloads. I think it was episode 45, how to double your downloads by curating the listening experience. And I know that there's specific episodes that have a spike in interest because I placed those episodes in that page because they were related. And so I have, I'd say probably 30% of my daily traffic is that one specific page. And so I always have like a high percentage of plays of that one specific episode. So again, the relationship with the marketing with explaining the downloads. And last but not least, something else that you want to consider is what device are they using when they're listening to the podcast, right? So are they Apple users? Are they Spotify users? Are they Android users? Are they going to be YouTube Music users? So when you're promoting the podcast, you have to think about maybe the downloads aren't that high because I promoted links on Apple Podcasts. And actually my audience is primarily coming from Spotify, right? Another one within that same realm is the percentage of where they're located. So you need to look into how the country, like for instance, my case is the US. The US is about 86% of my listenership. So when I'm marketing the podcast, I'm looking at the downloads and I'm thinking, okay, what is interesting the American segment of the population on which topics, what guests. So I'm making informed decisions on how I'm better serving my American listeners because there's just so many of them. And then lastly, the proportion of listeners to downloads. This is something that not every podcast platform will provide you, but you can manually do that. That's why I love Captivate so much because it gives you the unique listeners that day, that week, that month, those 90 days and all time versus the downloads. So basically, if you have let's say 20 downloads, but 20 listeners, it's 1 download per listener. But if you have 10 or 5 listeners and 20 downloads, it means that people were playing multiple episodes or they were replaying multiple times the same episode. This is really, really different because a hot lead will replay a lot of the same episode, and that's what actually happened to me. I had someone who listened to pretty much my whole catalog of content and then reach out to me on LinkedIn and they were like, oh my gosh, I am ready to work with you. That happened very recently via email as well. So that is something that I know that if I have a spike in, the number of downloads, but the listeners aren't that much that match the number of downloads, I'm guessing I'm going to get a hot lead coming through, which is super important to have as you create awareness of your products and services or everything else that you're creating. So I know I mentioned this episode was going to be quick. Absolutely not. Got out the window. I'm a nerd at heart. I can't break away from this. So I hope this podcast episode was helpful. I already know this podcast episode is going to be one of those that is going to have a high replay rate. And I don't want you to stay in just listening to the podcast episode. I do work with podcasters on a one-off consulting basis, but also as a long-term coach. So if you want to learn about better improve your podcast processes and increase your downloads, grow your listeners, increase the authority that you have online, and just have more fun while you're podcasting, talk to me. I will include the link in the show notes so you can work with me because I know so many of you, and yes, I'm talking to you, so many of you are thinking that you want 2024 to be a better year and you just don't know where to start. So let's start by working together so you can have direction in growing your podcast faster and more intentionally. All right, I've been Anna Xavier, and this was the Podcast Space, a place where you learn to improve your podcast one imperfect episode at a time. And I'll see you on the next episode.